One of the things that's exciting in Toronto right now is how much interest there is in the history of the city, and a lot of interest in this neighborhood, in the ward. So the ward was a really complex neighborhood in the city. It was largely residential, but there were also factories. So from where I'm standing in front of City Hall in Nathan Phillips Square, there were houses here. The community was rundown houses. It was very dirty. There wasn't a lot of plumbing. There weren't a lot of services. And so people really suffered. Harris wrote about that, and then he also started to paint the city and draw and think about it and write about it, as many other people did. The paintings that Harris created at that time give a very different impression of the neighborhood than comes across in what have become quite famous photographs by particularly Arthur Goss, but also William James, who were photographing the neighborhood for the press, but in the case of Goss, for the city. So at the time that Harris is walking around this neighborhood, looking at the homes, seeing these houses falling down, the conditions, the city's also looking and saying, what are we going to do about this? And so Arthur Goss, as a photographer, is out documenting the neighborhoods, but in particular photographing houses just before these were condemned houses that were about to be knocked down. So those images have given people a particularly strong image of a really bleak place. And there was a lot of bleakness in the neighborhood, but what you see in Harris's works is an attempt to draw out of this some other elements of the light, of the color, and sometimes a sort of sense of possibilities of potential joy for people. So he writes a great poem at one point that comments on the homes and how they're sort of running down, but somebody's made the effort to paint the door red. There's some kind of gesture of hope. He was really obsessed around those ideas. What is the future for people within a modern world that to him was something that seemed very negative. But some things still survive if you kind of spend some time wandering. So what was originally the poorhouse is on Elm Street, and it's actually part of the YWCA. The Arts and Letters Club is there. The Holy Trinity Church that is tucked in behind the Eaton Center has actually been there since before the 1850s. The Eaton Center actually stands on the site of where all the Eaton's warehouses were. So during the time that Harris is here, and in the background of many of his paintings and in the photographs, you will see these sort of towering red brick buildings that were the warehouses and the factories that were Eaton's. And the Eaton Center obviously was built on that land. If you look back, there's two really significant phases in it. In the 19th century, the ward was largely Irish immigrants from the United Kingdom. It also had a significant black community. There were a number of churches in the area. There was a significant archaeological dig recently on Chestnut Street for the British Methodist Episcopal Church, a congregation that still exists in the city. You also had a significant First Nations history to this region. In the early 20th century, you see a transition. You start to see immigration from Eastern Europe, the arrival of a substantial Jewish community into the neighborhood, people from all over the world. As this area started to be redeveloped, people were pushed out of the area. Some people, communities would resettle. The Jewish community resettled in Kensington Market, for example. Chinese community moving a little further west along Dundas Street to Spadina. The Italian community moving up into the area around College Street. And those moves have continued. But for others, there was a sense of moving out of the city itself. So this neighborhood is really the birthplace of this sort of modern Toronto. It's the heart of what the city is today. And I think what's emerging so much for us now is the realization that what we think of Toronto being now isn't new. It's always been a very complex, diverse city. We went through a significant period in Toronto where there was this modernist drive for renewal where we forgot about, I think, for many people, forgot about the true diversity. The way that Canadians have received the art, have understood Harris's art, these images of whiteness, the great white north, of erasure, of renewal, that's also contributed to a kind of an erasure of a wider, more complex understanding of the country. And that's not specifically a deep criticism of Harris. Harris was on an individual path as an artist. That was very clear by the late 20s and into the 30s. But as Canadians, it's more a critique of us as a country, as Canadians, on what we've tended to repeatedly embrace and to project. The idea of North, both in its US manifestation and then here again back in Toronto, has really embraced these ideas of a renewed approach, a kind of fresher approach, and a positive critical approach, which moves us all forward.